Does the Roman Catholic Church provide a moral framework that the modern world needs? Author Michael Coren thinks it does. In fact, he says the faith will be an even more relevant countercultural force in the future. And here he is, Michael Coren, author of The Future of Catholicism, and it's always good to have you back here at TVO, Michael.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to set up our discussion by reading an excerpt from your book, this from early on. Here we go. We do not, you tell us, become Catholics so as to be loved. We become Catholics so as to love. If Catholics want the first, they have to almost certainly come to the wrong place. To be genuinely countercultural is a dangerous place to be, and Catholicism is always countercultural. Being loved is actually relatively easy, whereas loving is often extremely difficult. Have you ever noticed that whenever Hollywood brings out yet another movie about the devil, the man standing up to old Nick and giving Satan a kick between the horns is never, with the greatest respect, a United Methodist minister, never a Unitarian, never even an Episcopalian. No, it's always a Roman Catholic priest, the heroic priest defying Lucifer, and all of his works is seldom lovable, but he's always relevant. You're a pretty good writer, I gotta say. That's pretty good.
Is that where I say when the going gets tough, the toughs get Catholic?
Yes,
because I rather like that.
That's right. Yes, indeed. Well, how do you feel that passage I just read sums up where Catholicism is today?
I think it does extremely well, and it's interesting with Pope Francis because there are some people who, on the left and the right, who believe that he's conforming with the culture, but the very opposite is the case. And just a week and a half ago or so, with this new document, the Gospel of Joy, he managed to provoke a lot of people, and thank goodness that he did, because he was saying, look, state socialism doesn't work. This obsession with personalities and gossip doesn't work, but neither does unfettered capitalism. Now, for him to say that, it's not revolutionary. Other popes have said it. Pope Leo back in 1891 said it, actually, but it sounds as though there's a different conversation taking place. At the same time, give you an example. When he was on the plane coming back from Brazil a while back, he used the word gay. I think the first pope to use the word gay. And quite right, too, because whilst the word homosexual is not pejorative, it is clinical. And gay people don't really want to be called, they'd rather be called gay. Well, then use the word. We live in a culture that is messy. We have to coexist. It's not triumphalist, thank God. Pluralism, democracy is a bit messy. And he's saying, we're countercultural. We're going to argue with you. But if we can build bridges, we will. And I think that is what makes the church so important at this particular time, because we have a leader who says, I'm not compromising. I mean, he says in the new document, ordination of women, that's not even an issue. Only a man can represent Christ at the Mass. It's only for men. But women's voices have to be heard far louder than they are now. He talks about papal authority being absolute. At the same time, I need help from people in autonomous synods, or relatively autonomous synods. So countercultural, where we have to be, but at the same time building bridges and opening doors where it's at all possible.
Next excerpt. What we do see is that younger people are attracted to and by orthodoxy. They don't want slightly Catholicized versions of what they encounter on a daily basis, but a glimpse of the beauty and eternal grace of Catholic worship. They want mystery, splendor, the supernatural truth of the Gospels. The reason so many teenagers buy so many vampire novels and people in their 20s read and watch sword and sorcery stories is that they need an alternative, even a flimsy, fatuous alternative, to the increasingly empty reality of modernity. What do you think the Catholic Church is providing to those who feel empty in the modern world?
It's providing a sense of the genuine supernatural, and I mean that in the real sense, the real definition of the word. It is reminding them this is the land of shadows and real life hasn't begun yet. What it's not doing, by the way, is giving community. I always find that to be a cop-out when people say community. Look, when I go back to England and watch Tottenham play, 40,000 people, that's community. I mean, we're singing and cheering and screaming together. My family's community, my friends are community. I don't necessarily find community within Catholic worship. Sometimes I do, but often I don't. It's not about that. That can be found elsewhere, and I think that's insulting to atheist communities or Jewish communities or Muslim communities. But it's the miracle of the Eucharist. Every church, everywhere, every day, all the time, the miracle of this is the body and blood of Christ. Even if the context and the surroundings seem quite banal. The guy next to you may be someone you know and don't like very much. The homily may be dreadful. I'm surely not. But it is the miracle of the body and blood of Christ. The Catholic Church, G.K. Chesterton said, being a Catholic prevents you from that horrible fate of being a prisoner of your own time. We live in a time where we've never had so much. Everything is given to us. But how happy are people? And the amount of antidepressants, suicide attempts, breakdown, family dismantling. people are looking for an alternative. That they don't go to so-called New Age out of fun. They go to so-called New Age out of boredom. They want something more. I think we do have a God-shaped vacuum, and we fill it with all sorts of things, not necessarily Catholicism, but if at all possible, we should try Catholicism.
If at all possible, we should try Catholicism. Does that go for everybody?
Yeah, it does, and I don't think Pope Francis has said anything different from that.
Well, when I say does it go for everybody, you mean you want Jews to convert to Catholicism? You want Christians to convert to Catholicism?
Well, non-Catholic Christians, particularly you, Steve. You know me. My parents weren't Catholic. My father was Jewish. I'm convinced I will see him again. He lived out his God-formed conscience to the best way he could. He was a loving, good man. And when Pope Francis said this, reiterated this, it was merely Catholic theology. We don't believe someone is not going to meet God because they're not a Catholic. But I believe that the most complete, full, pristine message, the megaphone, if you like, for God's voice is to be found in the Catholic Church.
Well, some very high-profile people have agreed with you. I think Conrad Black converted to Catholicism. Jason Kenney, the cabinet minister, converted to Catholicism.
Golly, the company I'm in.
Tony Blair, whom you have no doubt met. What's this mean? You're not sure about him?
I wish Tony Blair had been more of a Catholic when he was Prime Minister. And he came into the Catholic Church, and very quickly he was telling the Church to change its teaching on fundamental issues, which is something which got to be careful of pride. Pride is the biggie. Most sins, they're mere symptoms of pride. And to be a Catholic for a minute and a half and tell the Church to change on certain issues, maybe pride was there somewhere.
Gotcha. Let's go through some. Obviously, I did read the book, and you are nothing if not provocative and putting a stick out there to sort of
really
mix it up a bit, and that's fine. That's good. We need people to do that. But let's go through it. What's wrong? We live in 2013 now. What's wrong with using contraceptives?
Well, the church teaching has never been that every act of sex has to result in a baby, and the rhythm method was forgotten years and years ago. People who make jokes about the church should at least get the humour right and get it contemporary. The church believes, and so do I, that to actively and aggressively remove God from the marriage bed, and of course the assumption here within Catholicism is that sex takes place within marriage. I mean, I'm not a fool, I understand often it doesn't, but that's what we aspire to. And whilst sex is a good thing given to us by God, it's a lot of fun, it's wonderful, it's a fundamental part of our being and structure. To say that there can be no possibility of procreation, which must be at the center of marriage, is to say God has no place in our relationship. I mean, I don't want to be too graphic here, but church teaching is that there are certain days when you almost certainly will conceive. There are certain days when you may conceive, and certain days when you will not conceive. The self-control, with the woman often being in charge, saying, well, we're fine right now. You want to take the chance? I mean, I'm an old man at this point, but I'm speaking from memory, and those times when you really want to take a chance. I used to have hair, Steve. I've pulled it all out. But self-control, not just giving in to temptation, love being at the center, love for your spouse, and also love for God. And the idea of replacing love with latex or whatever, of using a pill which is meant to make you better, to stop the female body working as it should, to disrupt what is natural law, I have enormous problems with that. And when people say, well, you don't care about people in Africa, it's very hurtful, because before AIDS was known in the West, and it was in Africa for 30-odd years before it hit the West, very little was done. And the people who were working out there, the people who were changing the diapers of men dying, it was a Catholic church. It was a Catholic church that...
But why does it have to be either or?
Either contraception or not?
Yeah, I think the point you're trying to make is before the West got onto AIDS, it was Catholic missionaries, it was Catholic people who were administering to these very sick people in Africa. But why does the solution have to be no contraceptives allowed there at all, only our administering to people is permitted? Why could it not be a mix of both?
It doesn't seem to work. It's been tried.
Has it been tried?
It has in South Africa, certainly, and it's failed miserably. In Uganda, where they've tried to emphasize chastity, and by the way, that's not just the Catholic Church. The Anglicans are very strong. They're very conservative Anglicans in Uganda. It's been very successful. Contraceptives actually aren't natural to African culture. They tend not to be used. They enable as well. What tends to happen is it's not that people say, well, use these and be safe. We'll now feel that we can use them. and always be safe, and that's simply not the case. And it also, look, there are some...
What? You're saying the use of a condom does not always make you safe?
Well, it doesn't, unfortunately.
Well, nothing's 100%, but it's pretty close, isn't it?
Well, actually, what tends to happen is people have used them in the past, don't always use them. So they've used them once or twice, and they feel that sex is there whenever they want it, and they don't always use that condom. And only once not using it can mean a death sentence. Look, there are very compelling cases. What about the married couple where he is now infected? Or she, you know, these are very difficult and challenging. I think that the conversation is still taking place, but what I resent is people who have never done anything for people suffering in Africa, telling the church that does so much for people in Africa, you're wrong, you're cruel, you don't care.
Okay, really here's the next one. The church needs more priests. Some women would like to be priests. Ergo, more women should be priests. You say no, obviously. What would be so bad?
I'd like to play soccer for England. Mind you, at this stage I probably could because they're so useless. But
if you had you gave a bad example.
I did give a bad example.
Because if you had the talent,
ability, yes.
you could.
Yes.
Many women have the talent, but can't.
They have the talent to preach, they have the talent to love, they have the talent to understand, but they don't have the God-given gift of being a man. And when Jesus only ordained men, we don't have the authority to contradict Scripture. This is not about equality. And it's very interesting, and I think rather illuminating, that those women who are the most faithful Catholics, they don't talk about female ordination. That's not something they want. Women's voices must be heard. We have the Virgin Mary, Our Lady, we revere. Now, we're mocked for that, a woman.
By whom?
Oh, Protestant Christians are constantly mocking, which is ironic because some of their founders, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, Huss, they all revered, actually, Mary. But I think we are mocked for that. Doctors of the Church, Mother Teresa, Mother Angelica, people who've shaped the Church so very much. Women's voices certainly have to be heard, but ordination is not about equality, and it's not about the place of women, it's about the place of the priest. The main role of the vocation of a Catholic priest is to represent Jesus at the Mass.
Why can't a woman do that?
Well, I don't think a woman can do that.
Why not?
Because if we look at Scripture, and the early church, it was never permitted. It's not that we're making up as we go along. It's that Jesus gave certain commands. When he showed himself for the first time, it was to women whose word, whose testimony in a court in first century Judea, Palestine, was worth half of that of a man. So he wasn't saying women are not equal. And in fact, the reason so many women became Christians and slaves became Christians in the early church, it was based on equality and liberation. But never at that time were women ordained.
But if anybody's taking the host from a man, they're never under the illusion that they're taking it from Jesus.
It is Jesus. I mean, it is the body of Jesus.
But the person who hands it to you, the fact that that person is a male, nobody's confusing that person.
Well, actually, there are women who do that. I mean, but serving at the altar is something different. But you see, also there's a basic premise here that somehow there aren't enough clergy around. That isn't true. In Africa and Asia, they can barely cope with the number of young men who want to be clergy.
North America.
The numbers went down terribly in the late 60s and 70s. Now, they've come up now. They're never going to be what they were. I have no illusions there. But the quality is higher, and the numbers are pretty good, particularly in places like BC. In Hamilton, a wonderful director of vocations, a young Polish priest, numbers are up. So the numbers are up again, and the quality is immensely superior to what it was, say, 30, 40 years ago.
You do something in this book which you like to do, which is, and you just did it again here. You say, you know, we're constantly mocked for this, or we're constantly abused for this, or insulted for this. And I must tell you, unless I'm reading the wrong newspapers, I don't see a lot of that. I don't see a lot of mocking of the, in fact, you know, 2 of the last 3 popes have been quite beloved. You know, Francis and John Paul II, I think certainly John Paul II was a superstar, and Francis is, if he's not one already, he's certainly well on his way to being one. Yeah, now, admittedly, Benedict XVI was not everybody's idea of
Steve, touchy-feely. He was accused of being a Nazi, a Rottweiler. He was the most gentle, compassionate, loving of men. The most horrible things were said. And John Paul II, later on, things change a little, but he was accused of, we have this sort of law of diminishing papal nastiness. People forget what they said about popes at the time.
They loved him from the beginning. He was the guy who helped end the Cold War. He was the guy who helped bring down Jaruzelski in Poland.
Read some of what was said about
He was shot,
Joan
for goodness sakes.
Well, that's not exactly an act of love, is it?
No, but
he was shot.
But my point is, though, he had international sympathy on his side almost from the get-go, if not for his fighting communism, then for the fact that he came back from an assassination attempt, to the fact that he he was a hero to so many young people.
If you read what Christopher Hitchens, who was a friend of mine, the late Chris Hitchens or Dawkins or Sam Harris said about Pope John Paul, all sorts of horrendous things were said. But he certainly had a charisma, his acting ability, the way he met people. Benedict was treated very... I see now. We obviously see things through the prism of our own experience and our own lives, and we have certain sensitivities. But I have seen Catholicism mocked and abused on television far more than any other denomination.
In this country?
Oh yeah,
By whom?
More so in the UK and Europe, and even to the United States. And in the US, I mean, watch a few daily shows and see what happens.
Oh, but that's a comedy show. They're supposed to do that. They mock everybody.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to mock Islam or Judaism the same. And do you really think that people would say about Catholicism what they say about Islam? Islam, that it has to be debated and discussed. I mean, all sorts of fundamental and fundamentalist problems within Islam, but very little is said. The abuse crisis, and I mentioned it in this book, but in a former book I spent more time on it. It was so unfair what was said about the church. The abuse crisis was appalling. But it wasn't fundamentally different from what was going on in public education or organised sport or other denominations, but somehow it was always the Catholic Church. And the reaction of the church was generally, I mean, it may have been panic, it may have been fear. It was very rarely covering up, but they were accused of that time and time again.
Presumably, if you purport to represent God and his good works, you've got to do a little better than be...
I would agree with that.
Better than the Toronto Maple Leafs at this kind of stuff, right?
I mean... Well, you're a Habs fan. No, you are a Leafs fan. Of course, I'm sorry to say that.
Please.
No, you're quite right.
That's a sacrilege.
It is. That is a valid point. We should have done better. But when malice was implied, I mean, you know the standard response. It was move him, tell him never to do it again, and counsel him. Well, that's ridiculous. But that was the conventional wisdom given by secular psychiatrists to clergy and cardinals and bishops at the time.
But it may well be that the church doesn't hold the respect that you think it ought to hold in people's eyes, because A, this scandal happened in the first place, and B, the reaction to it was so bad, and C, we expected more from the Catholic Church.
Perhaps the third one I don't agree with. I think some of the people who are most critical didn't expect much at all. They were always quite opposed to the church. But the first two are valid, yes. I think the church lost so much. I mean, I meet priests who are nothing but good. They just try and do the best they can, and the initial perception is one of lack of trust. And it's horribly unfair, but in a way understandable.
Let's finish up with the newest superstar pope, if I can put it that way, because he has captured the imagination of so many around the world in such a short time, presumably in part because he seems less focused on a lot of the things that you've written books about in the past, and more focused on administering to the poor, which should be, I suspect, what the Church's mission is first and foremost all about. However, you do point out in the book that for those who see him as a kind of a big liberal reformer who's going to come in and make all the liberal people feel snugly about the church. That ain't on, is it?
No, it's not. I think we've already seen that. And by the way, I don't think that the church's primary aim is to help the poor. It's essential that we do, but the primary aim is to bring people back to God and to where he made us, he wants us to come back to him. But he's a beguiling figure. The church doesn't look left or right, it looks up. And to apply political labels, although it's convenient, I do it too, but in a way it doesn't help. He wasn't liked by other Jesuits in Latin America. They were very much on the left. They thought he was a conservative. He's not a progressive. That term doesn't apply. But what he has said is not very different from what Pope Benedict said, particularly about economic injustice and the poor. But there was never a conversation with Pope Benedict. He has captured the conversation. He's changed the narrative, and people are listening. And I think they're more than gestures. When he holds someone who is profoundly disabled, there seems to be something absolutely real. It's not a stunt. He's not doing this to say, look at me. There is something loving going on there.
He kisses the feet of the most desperately poor people in the world.
Yeah.
It's very impressive.
I found it extremely moving. Yeah. He's not altering the message, but he is transforming the way the message is delivered. When he says don't obsess about certain issues, he's not saying don't discuss those issues. He's saying, if no one's listening, what's the point? Make sure the door is open. We can speak to them. Now we can talk about them. But there are some people who they don't seem to even care if they're being listened to, as long as they speak. Well, Pope Francis is saying to those people, I believe, think again.
Is it your view? I know I hear you on the radio a lot and on your television show, and I think I've heard you say in the past, you know what, the issues of sexual orientation and the issues of abortion, we've kind of lost those wars. Your side has lost. Do you think Francis believes that as well?
Well, on same-sex marriage, the debate is pretty much over.
Yeah.
Abortion is still ongoing, and we're making victories, and they're different issues too. Yeah. I mean, someone can support same-sex marriage and believe that life begins at conception. But on same-sex marriage, the battle now is to maintain our right to say, no, we disagree. And I think we'll be okay with that. No, he's not saying that, and in Croatia just recently there was a referendum, many other countries who say no to same-sex marriage. What he's saying is there is something holistic, there is a grand message here, and it can't be limited by human ambition or even human battles. Life does begin at conception and ends at natural death. I mean, he's absolutely guaranteed on that. How can he? I mean, he's the Pope. He does believe that marriage is sacramental and child-centered, and the procreative norm has to be at its epicenter. But within that, there is so much more to discuss. And how often do I sit down with gay friends and talk about what it means to be Catholic? And a great deal of what I say, they're listening to. If I sit down with them and say, I want to talk to you about same-sex marriage, they're going to give me 5 minutes and then walk out.
Right.
So we have to be subtle, not crafty, but subtle and empathetic, and realize that the GPS doesn't always work. There are different routes to get to the same destination.
Interesting. Nice way to put it. Michael Coren, as always, you give us a lot to think about in your very provocative books. This one's called The Future of Catholicism. And as always, we wish you well, and thanks for coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you, my friend.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.